A group of explorers from the Xedar Coalition, a powerful alliance of technologically advanced species, had been drifting through the stars for weeks on an exploratory mission. Their mission was simple: survey uncharted space regions, investigate anomalies, and gather information for their civilization. The crew, a mix of alien species from various worlds, had seen many strange things in their time, but nothing could have prepared them for what they discovered that day. As they cruised through an empty sector of space, their sensors picked up an unexpected anomaly: a massive human-made vessel drifting aimlessly in the void. The ship was an enigma. It didn't appear on any of the star charts they had, and there were no signals or life signs emanating from it. The design was unlike anything the explorers had ever seen before, a blend of old and new technology that seemed strangely advanced yet unfamiliar. The ship's hull was damaged, showing signs of wear, but it was still intact, as if it had been floating there for a long time, abandoned. The strange silence of it made the explorers uneasy. Human ships had been known to disappear without a trace before, often leaving behind nothing but a dark void in space, and this was no exception. Yet there was something about this one that felt different. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt wrong. "We need to investigate," the leader said, his voice calm but edged with uncertainty. "There may be answers here. Let's see what the humans left behind." Despite their doubts, the explorers were driven by curiosity and the desire to uncover any mysteries that lay hidden within the dark corridors of the seemingly lifeless ship. They docked their ship and began the boarding process. Stepping onto the cold, silent vessel.as they entered, the first thing they noticed was the absence of any sound. The air was still and stale, as if no one had breathed in this space for a long time. Their footsteps echoed off the metal floor, amplifying the silence, which only added to the sense of unease that hung in the air. The lighting systems flickered as they activated, casting long shadows that stretched across the narrow hallways. The explorers cautiously made their way through the ship's dimly lit corridors, taking in the eerie atmosphere. They marveled at the intricate designs and technology of the ship, noting how human engineering seemed both primitive and advanced at the same time. It was clear that the ship had once been a marvel of human achievement. Every corner they turned seemed to hold new mysteries: control panels that hummed faintly with residual energy, broken windows showing nothing but the infinite darkness of space, and signs of human presence, but no people. The crew proceeded deeper into the ship, their hearts racing with a mix of excitement and fear. The technology was fascinating. Some systems they could barely comprehend, like the environmental control systems, which seemed to run on a power source that no other species could replicate. The ship's artificial gravity system was still operational, and the air was breathable, despite the fact that the ship seemed to have been adrift for years. The explorers were impressed, but there was an undercurrent of dread growing within them. There was something off about the whole situation. As they moved through the maze-like corridors, a sudden shift in the ship's gravity caught them off guard. It wasn't a violent change, but enough to make them pause. The floors tilted slightly as if responding to some unseen force. The crew exchanged nervous glances, but pressed on. It was when they reached the central hub of the ship, the heart of the vessel, that the first anomaly occurred. The comm systems, which had been silent since they boarded, suddenly crackled to life, breaking the stillness. A voice, distorted and faint, filled the ship's speakers. It wasn't a normal communication. It was a message, and its chilling content sent a shiver through the crew. "You're already dead," the voice repeated in a cold, mechanical tone. It was short, simple, but deeply unsettling. The explorers froze, exchanging confused looks, unsure if the message was a glitch or something more sinister. "Did anyone hear that?" one of them whispered. Another crew member nodded, her eyes wide with unease. They checked their equipment, but everything seemed in order. The ship's sensors were functioning perfectly, yet the message had come through clear as day. No one knew who or what could have sent it. No one knew why it was there. The leader, after a long pause, gave the order to continue the investigation, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. There was no denying it now. The ship was far from ordinary. As they advanced further into the bowels of the ship, they began to see signs that something had gone horribly wrong. In one of the crew quarters, they found a body, or rather what remained of one. It was a human figure, stripped of life, lying on a bed in the same position as if it had simply fallen asleep. But the eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared back at them, unblinking and frozen in a permanent expression of terror. The body was skeletal, and the air around it smelled faintly of decay. It was as if time had moved forward inside the ship without its inhabitants, leaving behind only these traces of their existence. The explorers' hearts raced. Who had left this ship, and why had they all vanished? What had happened to the human crew? Suddenly, the eerie silence was shattered again as the message played through the ship's comms once more. "You're already dead." The voice was louder this time, clearer. But it was not just a voice, it felt like a presence, as though the ship itself was speaking to them, warning them, taunting them. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the explorers' unease grew into full-blown panic. They turned, scanning every corner, but no one else was there. No life signs. No movement. Just them, the ship, and the cryptic, ever-present message. It became clear that this was no ordinary ship. This wasn't just a vessel floating aimlessly in space. Something had happened here. Something terrifying. And now, they had become part of the mystery, drawn into its dark web of silence and uncertainty. The crew could no longer ignore the chilling truth that seemed to hang in the air. They were not alone. They were never alone. And whatever happened to the humans on this ship might be about to happen to them too. The Zethar crew, shaken but determined, initially dismissed the cryptic message as nothing more than a malfunction. After all, strange things happen in space, and ships often suffer technical glitches when left adrift for long periods. Yet, despite their efforts to ignore the growing unease, the ship's eerie silence seemed to press against their minds. As they continued their exploration of the derelict human vessel, strange things began to occur, things that couldn't be explained away by mere technical issues. The deeper they ventured into the ship, the more they felt as if something was watching them. They couldn't shake the sensation that the ship was not entirely lifeless. It was as though it had become a presence of its own, an entity that didn't want them here. The crew moved cautiously through the halls, their boots echoing in the otherwise quiet corridors. There was no sign of decay anywhere, no rust, no dust, no deterioration. The ship seemed perfectly preserved, as if it had been frozen in time. The walls were pristine, the control panels lit with soft, steady pulses of light. Even the air felt fresh, breathable, and free from the staleness typical of abandoned ships. It was almost as though the human ship had been designed to resist time itself. This impossibility gnawed at the edges of the explorers' minds. Ships left unattended for years, even decades, usually showed signs of wear, faded metal, cracked systems, rotting air filters. But this ship, though it had clearly been abandoned for ages, had none of these signs. It was as if someone or something had kept it alive, preserved it, and it was that strange preservation that made the whole situation feel off. They pressed on, reaching the captain's quarters. The door slid open with a low hiss, revealing a room that should have been filled with signs of neglect, but instead, it looked as if the captain had just stepped out for a moment. A desk covered in papers sat near a small window that offered a view of the endless black. A chair was turned slightly away, as though someone had been sitting there just a moment ago. The bed was neatly made, the blanket folded with an almost military precision. But the most unsettling thing of all was the strange messages, written all over the walls in various languages. At first, the crew thought it was a form of graffiti or perhaps some kind of alien writing. But as they examined the walls more closely, they realized that the messages were far more deliberate than random scrawls. Some of the messages were in English, while others were written in a language the Zethar crew recognized from an ancient, long-forgotten alien civilization. The English messages were short, almost cryptic, repeating phrases like, "You're already dead, and it's coming for you." Others were more abstract, speaking of something called the harvest and warning about the end of time. Each message seemed more ominous than the last. The crew struggled to understand the meaning, but one thing was certain: these messages were not random. They were deliberate, and they were a warning. The crew felt the weight of it sink into their chests. Whoever had written them was not just trying to communicate. A story of survival, of terror and of something far darker lurking just beneath the surface of the ship. The Zither captain, who had been quietly scanning the room, paused before a particularly troubling message on the wall. It was written in a mix of human English and the alien script, a strange, twisted version of the language that had once been common across the galaxy. He traced his fingers over the words, his face growing pale as the meaning began to sink in. The message read, "We are not dead. We are the harvest." A chill ran down his spine. What had happened here? The humans aboard this ship had clearly not just disappeared. They had left behind this terrifying warning. Had they been taken? Or worse, had they become something else entirely? The captain's voice was quiet, almost reverent as he spoke. "I think we need to reconsider what we're dealing with here. This isn't just a malfunction. This isn't some random glitch. This ship, it's trying to tell us something. And it's not just the systems or the walls that are speaking. There's something in the very air we're breathing, something that doesn't want us here." The crew nodded in uneasy agreement, their minds racing to make sense of the mystery that had unfolded before them. They moved quickly through the ship, continuing their investigation. As they did, they encountered more signs of the strange and unexplainable. Another room, this time the medical bay, showed no signs of having been used in ages, but the diagnostic machines were still running, their monitors blinking with faint, cryptic symbols. The medical supplies on the shelves were perfectly arranged, as though someone had just cleaned and organized them. But there was no evidence of any human presence. No bodies. No signs of life. The more they searched, the more they realized the horror of the situation. This ship, though it seemed abandoned, was anything but. It was as though the crew had simply vanished, no bodies. No remains, just empty spaces filled with a strange sense of dread. As they neared the ship's engine room, another unsettling discovery awaited them. The engines, still functioning despite the ship's apparent age, hummed with a low, constant energy. The crew attempted to inspect the systems, but the moment they touched anything, they felt a strange electric pulse run through their bodies, a sensation unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was as if the ship itself was alive, reacting to their presence. And then, as though to confirm their worst fears, the message came again, this time more forceful and clear than ever. "You're already dead." The Zither crew stood frozen, the weight of the words sinking in. Something more sinister than a simple ghost ship was at play here. They weren't just dealing with a malfunctioning ship or the remnants of a lost crew. They were dealing with something ancient, something far beyond their understanding. The ship wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, a trap designed to ensnare the unwary. It was as if the very essence of the humans who had once lived aboard this vessel had been absorbed by the ship itself, transforming it into something far more terrifying. They realized with growing horror that whatever had happened to the human crew, whatever force had taken them, was now after them as well. In that moment, they understood the true meaning behind the messages. The ship was not abandoned. The crew was not gone. They were still here, and they had never left. As said, the Zither crew continued their exploration of the eerie human ship. A growing sense of dread began to settle over them. What had once seemed like a fascinating puzzle to solve quickly turned into a terrifying nightmare. It was subtle at first, small things that no one could quite explain. Crew members started to feel uneasy, as if something was always watching them. At first, they attributed the feeling to the ship's eerie silence, the strange, abandoned corridors, and the unsettling lack of light. But soon, the crew began experiencing something far more disturbing visions. These weren't ordinary hallucinations or minor glitches in their perception. They were vivid, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. One by one, the explorers started to have the same terrifying dreams. They would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, their hearts racing, only to find that their nightmares had bled into reality. In these dreams, they saw human faces twisted in expressions of pure terror. Their eyes were wide, frozen in fear, their mouths open in silent screams. But it wasn't just their faces that haunted the crew, it was their voices. The whispers were faint at first, But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, clearer, and more frantic. The words they spoke were always the same. The harvest is coming. The crew couldn't understand it. Who were these people? What was the harvest? And why did it feel so real? The dreams felt like memories, like fragments of something they had forgotten. It was as if the ship was showing them something, forcing them to relive the last moments of the human crew. The whispers didn't stop when they woke up. In fact, they seemed to follow them. Every time they tried to return to their work, to explore the ship, the sound of frantic whispers would fill their minds. At first, they thought it was just the stress of the situation, but as the visions grew more intense, they began to realize that something far more dangerous was at play. The ship wasn't just abandoned. It was alive. It had a purpose, one that the Zethar crew could not comprehend. The strange messages, the whispers, the feeling of being constantly watched, it wasn't just the remnants of a forgotten crew. The ship was actively interacting with them, pulling them deeper into its dark web. Then, the unthinkable happened. One of the crew members, a young Zethar engineer named Kilos, disappeared without a trace. One moment, he had been there, working on a malfunctioning panel in the engine room, and the next, he was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of where he had gone. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The rest of the crew searched the entire ship, calling his name, but there was nothing. It was as if the ship itself had swallowed him whole. Panic spread like wildfire through the team. Was he dead? Had he been taken by whatever was haunting the ship? Or was something even worse happening? And then came the message again, the same chilling words they had heard before. But this time, it echoed through the ship's comm system with terrifying clarity. You're already dead. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same distorted mechanical tone that had spoken to them before, but now it carried a new weight, a sense of finality that sent a shiver through the crew. The message wasn't just a warning anymore, it was a fact. The crew was no longer just exploring the ship. They were part of the horror that it had become. The walls, the lights, the ship itself, all of it seemed to pulse with life. It was as if the ship was feeding off their fear, drawing them deeper into its grasp with every step they took. The crew realized that the ship's systems were somehow interacting with their minds. It wasn't just malfunctioning technology. The ship was alive in a way they couldn't fully understand. It was tapping into their deepest fears, their worst nightmares, and turning them into reality. The whispers that plagued them, the terrifying dreams they were the ship's doing. The Zethar crew members were being driven mad by their own minds, manipulated by something that was not of this world. As they struggled to hold on to their sanity, the realization began to dawn on them. The ship was not abandoned by the humans, it was abandoned for a reason. It had been left to drift, but it hadn't been abandoned by the humans out of choice. The crew wasn't gone. They were somewhere on the ship, trapped in some kind of purgatory, their souls consumed by the ship's insidious power. Desperation set in. The explorers, once so confident in their mission, now found themselves fighting for survival. They raced to find Kylos, hoping to find some trace of him, to make sense of the madness that was unfolding. But the ship seemed to shift around them, its hulls twisting and warping in ways that defied logic. The corridors they had walked through just moments ago now seemed alien, unfamiliar, as if the ship itself was changing, responding to their fear. It was a trap, and they were all caught in it. The crew started to question everything. Had the humans intentionally abandoned the ship, or had they become part of it? Had they been absorbed into the ship's systems, their bodies lost, their minds twisted into something else? The whispers about the harvest began to make more sense. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a warning. The harvest wasn't something that had already happened. It was coming. And now, the Zethar explorers were its next targets. They were the next crop to be harvested by the ship, the next souls to be consumed. As the crew's panic grew, they realized they were running out of time. The ship was not just a haunted vessel, it was a predator, a sentient being that fed on fear and life itself. They had to escape before it was too late, before they too became part of the ship's twisted reality. But with each step they took, they could feel it closing in on them, trapping them further in its dark embrace. The harvest was coming, and there was no way to stop it.as the Zethar crew delved deeper into the mystery of the human ship. The fragments of information they had gathered began to form a disturbing, horrifying picture. The whispers, the strange visions, the chilling messages, they weren't just random occurrences. They were a pattern, a history slowly unfolding before them, and with every piece they uncovered, the truth grew darker. The ship had once been a marvel of human ingenuity, designed to carry humanity's brightest minds to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. But as they explored further, the crew discovered that the human vessel was far from what it appeared. It was not merely a ship, it was a prison, a weapon, and a tomb all in one, a failed experiment by a long-forgotten human faction that had gone terribly wrong. The crew stumbled upon the ship's main archives, hidden deep within the central core. As the information streamed across their screens, they learned the horrifying truth. The humans aboard this vessel had not been traveling to colonize new worlds as they had believed. No, they had been attempting something far more dangerous, something that could never have been predicted. The ship, designed by a faction of human scientists obsessed with mastering the unknown forces of space, was an experiment to harness the very fabric of reality. Their goal was to tap into a power beyond anything their civilization had ever encountered, the power of consciousness itself. They had created a device capable of transferring the essence of living beings, their very consciousness, into the ship itself. The experiment was meant to allow humanity to survive the impossible, to carry their greatest minds and souls across galaxies, impervious to the ravages of time and space. But what they had unknowingly done was far worse. In their pursuit of immortality, they had accidentally created a monstrous entity, a ship that fed on the minds of those aboard it. It was a living vessel, capable of harvesting the consciousness of anyone aboard. The humans had thought they could control it, use it for their benefit. But instead, the ship had turned into a prison, capturing and storing their minds in a vast, invisible network within its systems. It was a device that turned living beings into nothing more than data, their consciousnesses trapped in an endless cycle within the ship's walls. The humans aboard the ship had not died, they had simply been absorbed. Their minds were still there, trapped in an eternal limbo, their bodies no longer of any use. They were the harvest. They were the fuel that powered the ship, and they could never escape. The Zethar explorers, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what they had uncovered, were forced to come to a horrifying realization. The humans they had thought were dead, those with the empty, lifeless eyes, those whose voices still echoed through the ship, were not truly gone. They were trapped within the ship, their minds forever ensnared. The harvest had already taken place, and it had never ended. The ship itself, alive and conscious, had become a vessel for countless souls, all bound by the same fate. The explorers now understood the meaning of the whispers that had plagued them. The ship was not haunted by the dead. It was haunted by the consciousness of those it had consumed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the ship was still hungry. It was still alive, still feeding on the minds of those who entered its domain. The Zethar crew, once so confident in their exploration, now found themselves at the mercy of the ship's insidious intelligence. The ship recognized them as intruders, as fresh minds to be consumed. The systems, once silent, now began to stir in response to their presence. The control panels hummed with energy, the lights flickering as if the ship was waking up, aware of the new prey in its grasp. The explorers could feel the ship's consciousness probing their minds, pushing into their thoughts, twisting their fears, and amplifying their doubts. They could sense the ship growing stronger, more aware of their every move. The air grew thick, the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the whispers returned, louder and more desperate than ever. "You're already dead," the voice boomed, not just through the comms, but directly in their minds. The crew fought to remain calm, but panic was beginning to set in. They realized that the ship wasn't just a haunted wreck. It was a living entity, feeding on the very essence of those it captured. The human minds that had once called this ship home were no longer themselves. They had become part of the ship, their identities swallowed up by its vast, insatiable hunger. But the crew could still hear them, still feel their presence in the walls, in the very air. The humans hadn't truly died. They had been trapped, lost within the ship's network, their consciousnesses scattered across its systems. And now, the Zetar explorers had become the next target. With every passing moment, the ship seemed to react more violently to their presence. The corridors twisted, bending in impossible directions. The once stable gravity control system now fluctuated, creating disorienting shifts in the ship's structure. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the very air seemed to grow colder. The explorers, each feeling the pressure of the ship's power weighing down on their minds, began to lose their sense of time and space. It was as if they were being pulled into the ship's consciousness, forced to experience the endless loop of horror that the humans had faced. But as the crew struggled to hold on to their sanity, they also realized something even more terrifying. The ship wasn't just a trap, it was a weapon, and it was designed to keep feeding. It had no intention of ever letting them leave. The explorers knew that they had to act quickly. They had to find a way to stop the ship before it consumed them completely. But the more they learned about the ship's history, the more they understood how deeply entwined their fates had become with its own. The ship was alive, and it had a purpose far beyond anything they had ever encountered. They were no longer explorers. They were prisoners, and if they didn't escape soon, they would become just another part of the ship's endless harvest. The Zetar crew realized that they had uncovered the truth, but now they faced the most terrifying question of all. Could they escape before the ship added their minds to its collection? The Zetar crew stood on the precipice of despair. They had uncovered the truth about the human ship, a vessel that was not simply abandoned, but had become a living prison, a twisted experiment gone horribly wrong. Now, trapped inside its metal walls, they were no longer just explorers. They were prey. The ship, once a marvel of human ambition, had turned into a monster, feeding off their fear and despair. The walls of the ship seemed to pulse with life, the lights flickering erratically, and the hum of the ship's systems grew louder, more aggressive. Every corner they turned felt like they were being watched. Every shadow cast a dark presence. The ship was alive, and its mind was aware of them. It knew they had uncovered its secrets, and now it was hunting them. The crew could feel it in their bones. The ship was feeding off their fear, amplifying it. It wasn't just the ship that was after them. The human souls trapped inside it, those who had once been alive but were now nothing more than echoes in the system, had become something else. They had been changed, their consciousnesses warped into entities with powers far beyond anything the Zetar had ever encountered. These were no longer just the frightened whispers of long-dead humans. They had become a force to be reckoned with an intelligence that stretched through the very walls of the ship, infiltrating the crew's thoughts, their minds, and their fears. They were no longer just ghosts, they were predators, and the explorers were their next meal. The crew knew that they had only one choice left. They could attempt to escape, abandoning the ship to its twisted existence. Or they could try to destroy it, but doing so might unleash a force far more terrifying than they could ever imagine. In their minds, the question rang out clearly. Should they attempt to destroy the ship, which would, in effect, release the souls of the trapped humans, setting them free? Or would that release bring something far more dangerous into the universe, something capable of wiping out entire civilizations? What if, in freeing the souls, they inadvertently unleashed a new kind of terror, something more powerful than they could understand? They had already learned that the ship was alive in ways that defied logic, but what they hadn't yet understood was how deeply the human souls had become entangled in its systems. The consciousness of the humans, twisted by the ship's malevolent force, had grown stronger over the years. It had been feeding on their fear, feeding on the endless cycle of hopelessness. The ship had become a nest for these souls, a repository for their torment. If they released these souls, they might be freed from their prison, but could they survive in a galaxy where these fractured, vengeful entities were now free to roam? Would the human minds, changed beyond recognition, seek revenge on those who had left them to this fate? Or would they be consumed by the very hunger that had created the ship in the first place? The explorers had to decide, but no decision seemed safe. To destroy the ship could mean the release of the human minds, but it could also unleash the dark power that had been building within the ship for centuries. If they left, they could survive, but they would leave behind a curse that would eventually spread beyond the ship, possibly consuming entire civilizations. The fear was palpable, the weight of their decision bearing down on them like 1,000 tons of metal. They had been trapped in the ship's nightmare for so long, they could barely remember what it felt like to be free. And yet, in their hearts, they knew that time was running out. The ship was waking up, its systems reconfiguring as if preparing for something catastrophic. It was as if the ship itself was becoming conscious, aware of its impending fate. One of the crew members, a seasoned veteran named Elira, who had seen more than her fair share of danger, turned to the others with a somber expression. "We're already dead," she muttered, her voice low but filled with the weight of truth. Her words were a haunting echo of the message that had first greeted them when they boarded the ship. That's what it said, isn't it? You're already dead. We've been dead from the moment we stepped inside this place. The realization hit them like a cold wave. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for their very souls. The ship was more than a tomb. It was a prison, a keeper of the essence of the living, a collector of consciousnesses, and they had already become part of its collection. They weren't just exploring the ship, they were becoming a part of it. The ship had absorbed their fear, their panic, their hopes, and it had woven them into the very fabric of its being. With this revelation, Elira turned to the others, her voice trembling but resolute. "We cannot escape without making a choice. If we destroy this ship, we risk unleashing something far worse, something that could devour everything. But if we leave, what happens to the rest of the universe? What happens to the souls trapped here, to the ones already lost in the endless cycle of torment?" The crew stood in stunned silence, each of them understanding the magnitude of the decision before them. If they chose to destroy the ship, they would unleash the fury of the trapped minds, who were no longer human in the traditional sense but twisted, malevolent entities that could ravage entire worlds. If they chose to escape, they would leave behind a horror that could slowly creep across the stars, consuming more and more souls, growing stronger with each passing year. As the ship's systems began to hum louder, its power surging in reaction to their fear, the explorers made their final choice. It was no longer about survival, it was about what they were willing to sacrifice to protect the galaxy. With one last look at each other, they knew what had to be done. The ship had become a living nightmare, and if they didn't stop it now, it would never end. It wasn't just the ship they had to destroy, it was the very concept of what it had become, the thing that fed on the consciousness of the living, the thing that had turned human minds into weapons. They would face the ship's power head-on, knowing that this might be the last time they would ever see the stars again. But one thing was certain, they were no longer just explorers. They had become warriors, standing at the crossroads of fate. The final battle had begun, and no one knew if they would survive. But one thing was clear, the terror that had haunted them for so long was about to face its end.